6,000 years ago, a single degree of axial tilt, 1 degree, began to pull the reins away from North Africa. That's it, 1 degree. And the most densely populated, biologically diverse, culturally complex landmass on Earth began to die. Think about that for a moment. Not a meteor, not a supervolcano, not a war. A single degree of orbital wobble in Earth's relationship with the Sun, something measurable, something documented in the paleoclimate record with extraordinary precision, began a process that swallowed 4 million square miles of grassland, forest, and river basin under sand. The event geoscientists call the African humid period ended roughly 5,500 to 5,000 years ago. Before that threshold, the Sahara was a place of lakes so large they appear in the fossil record as ancient shorelines, of rivers that fed directly into the Mediterranean, of hippos and crocodiles living in waters that are now, today, buried under 30 feet of windblown dust. Geologist Stefan Kropolin's work in the Chad Basin has recovered fossilized fish hooks, pottery fragments, and cattle bones from sites that now sit in the middle of absolute desert, a landscape where no living thing survives a summer afternoon exposed. The people were there, the animals were there, the water was there. And then the tilt changed, and the monsoon shifted south, and the largest desert on Earth was born in what felt in geological time like a single exhale. But here's the question that I cannot stop thinking about, the one that changes everything once you really let it land. What if it didn't happen? What if the orbital mechanics had gone even slightly differently? If the axial wobble had held, or reversed, or stalled at a different position? What if the Sahara had stayed green? Because the answer, once you work through the actual historical and scientific record, is not just that Africa would look different. It's that almost everything you think you know about the ancient world, about the rise of Western civilization, about why the map of global power looks the way it does right now today, essentially none of it holds. We're talking about a world so radically different from our own that the challenge isn't imagining the changes. It's imagining what, if anything, would have survived intact. Here's where you have to start, with the sheer scale of what the African humid period actually was. We're not talking about a slightly wetter Sahara. Paleoclimatologist Nick Drake's research in the Libyan desert has documented a network of ancient river systems, rivers as large as the modern Rhine, that flowed north across what is now the central Sahara toward the Mediterranean coast. The Chad Basin, which today holds a shrinking remnant lake, was once a body of water called Mega Lake Chad that covered an area roughly the size of the Caspian Sea, around 400,000 square kilometers. Just to be clear about the timescale here, Mega Lake Chad existed and thrived for thousands of years before the pyramids were built. By the time Khufu ordered the first stone placed at Giza, the lake was already retreating. The Sahara was already dying. These were not ancient myths or folk memories. These are GPS-mapped lake beds, carbon-dated fish bones, and stratigraphic records published in journals including Nature and quaternary science reviews. The Green Sahara is as documented as anything in the geological past. Now take that dying away. Keep the lake, keep the rivers, keep the rainfall patterns that sustain them. The West African monsoon system locked in its northward position by a slightly different Earth-Sun geometry. And just to be clear about what you're preserving one of the most agriculturally productive environments on Earth, sitting in a geographic position that connects sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean basin with no barrier whatsoever. No desert, no sand wall, no fire and desiccation. Just continuous fertile land running from the West African tropics, across the Sahel, through the river systems of the Central Sahara, all the way to the shores of what the Greeks would later call the Middle Sea. And this is where it gets strange, because the first thing most people assume when they imagine this alternate world is simply that Africa would be richer, more populated, more powerful. And that's true, but it doesn't remotely capture the actual depth of the transformation. The Sahara Desert didn't just impoverish Africa. It created the conditions that made ancient Egypt Egypt. It created the conditions that isolated sub-Saharan Africa from Eurasian trade networks for millennia. It created the geographic logic that made the Mediterranean the engine of the ancient world rather than a regional feature within a larger continental system. Remove the Sahara and Egypt, as we know it, as historians have studied it, as popular culture has mythologized it, almost certainly doesn't exist in recognizable form. Here's the thing. The Nile Valley civilization emerged specifically because it was an oasis in an increasingly hostile desert. Archaeological evidence documented by Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson shows that the Proto-Egyptian populations of the pre-dynastic period were not originally Nile Valley people at all. They were Saharan pastoralists, cattle herders and fishers from the Green Sahara, who were pushed progressively toward the Nile as the desert advanced around them, beginning around 5000 BCE. This is not a minor scholarly footnote. This is the origin story of one of history's most celebrated civilizations, and it begins with climate catastrophe and forced migration. The desiccation of the Sahara didn't just happen alongside the rise of Egyptian civilization. It caused it by compressing a dispersed and diverse population into a narrow, extraordinarily productive river corridor where agricultural surplus, social hierarchy, and monumental building became both possible and necessary. No dying Sahara means no compression. No compression means the Proto-Egyptian populations don't concentrate. The Nile Valley remains one productive corridor among many. Important certainly, but not the only viable agricultural zone in a 10 million square kilometer region. And without that concentration, without that surplus-generating bottleneck, demographic modeling by archaeologist Andrew Sherratt suggests you lose the specific pressure toward bureaucratic state-building that produced pharaonic Egypt. What emerges instead, across the Green Sahara, is almost certainly a network of smaller, more dispersed city-states and trading federations, something closer to the settlement patterns of the West African Sahel today than to the vertical, centralized structure of the Nile Kingdom. Multiple competing centers, multiple agricultural heartlands, multiple writing systems potentially, rather than one, multiple currencies, multiple monumental traditions. I know that sounds like it diminishes Africa somehow, and I want to push back against that framing hard, because this is actually the part that reveals how distorted our mental model of this history already is. The absence of pharaonic Egypt in the alternate timeline isn't a loss for African civilization, it's a redistribution. The agricultural surplus, the population density, the monumental ambition, none of those capacities disappear. They spread across a continent-sized green corridor instead of concentrating in one river valley. You get more centers of civilization, not fewer. You get more competing and cooperating urban cultures, more technological traditions, more languages, more trade goods circulating across a connected interior. The historical record from the actual West African empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, which flourished even with the desert in place by exploiting the thin, viable zone at the Sahara's southern edge, gives us a partial window into what this alternate world might have looked like at scale. By any measure of per capita wealth, institutional sophistication, or administrative complexity, the Mali Empire of the 13th and 14th centuries matched or exceeded anything happening in medieval Europe at the same time. And that empire operated with the desert still in place. Remove the desert, and the scale of what becomes possible expands by an order of magnitude. And here's what the research actually shows about human population in this alternate world. And this is a number that stops me cold every time I work through it. The Green Sahara, at its peak during the African humid period, supported an estimated population density roughly equivalent to the modern Sahel, meaning somewhere between 5 and 15 people per square kilometer across what is now absolute desert. Multiply that density across the 9.2 million square kilometers of the modern Sahara, and you're looking at somewhere between 46 and 138 million additional people living in North and Central Africa before the desiccation, people whose descendants were either killed by the advancing desert or forced into the narrow, viable zones along its margins. Demographer Andrew Hines' modeling of pre-agricultural and early agricultural population dynamics suggests that a continuously habitable and agriculturally productive Sahara region, integrated into early trade networks rather than destroyed by climate shift, could plausibly have supported 10 to 20 times the actual historical population of North Africa by the first millennium of the Common Era. That's not a small difference. That is the difference between a marginal northern coast and a demographic giant. And demographic size in the ancient world is nearly everything. It determines army size, agricultural output, the scale of urban markets, the speed of technological development, the complexity of institutions. A North Africa with 150 million people integrated into continental trade networks by the 1st century CE would not be a supplier to the Roman Empire. It would dwarf the Roman Empire, and every political entity in the Mediterranean basin would be organizing its strategy around it rather than the reverse. Right? But I haven't even gotten to the part that changes the modern world most completely. Because here is what the Green Sahara does to the ancient Mediterranean, to Greece, to Rome, to the entire civilizational arc that defines Western history as conventionally told. The Mediterranean was the engine of the ancient world because it was a highway. Water-based trade is faster, cheaper, and higher volume than any overland alternative. And the Mediterranean connected the agricultural surpluses of Egypt and the Levant to the timber of Anatolia, the metals of Iberia, and the cultural innovations of Greece in a closed loop that amplified everything it touched. This worked in part because the Mediterranean's southern shore, North Africa, was accessible from the sea, but its hinterland was, after the Sahara formed, essentially impenetrable. The desert acted as a wall that channeled all North African economic energy northward into the Mediterranean system. Carthage, Rome's great rival, sat on the Tunisian coast and projected power into the sea precisely because there was nowhere else for its hinterland energy to go. The desert pushed everything north. Remove that wall. Open the hinterland. Suddenly, the Mediterranean isn't a closed loop. It's a northern coastline of a continent whose interior is as economically productive as its shores. Trans-Saharan trade, which in actual history was a late and limited phenomenon, built across one of the most dangerous environments on Earth using camel caravans that took weeks to cross the ERG, becomes in the alternate timeline the dominant economic axis of the ancient world. The question isn't whether Carthage would trade with Rome. The question is whether either of them faces competition so vast, so deeply connected to sub-Saharan gold, iron, ivory, and agricultural surplus that the whole Mediterranean configuration of power becomes secondary to a continental African economy operating on its own internal logic. And this is the part that genuinely unsettles me every time I think about it. Because Roman power was always partly a function of geographic constraint. Rome dominated because the Mediterranean was the only game worth playing in that region. In a Green Sahara world, the Mediterranean may not be the most important body of water on Earth. It may be a northern lake on the edge of a much larger story. If this is already making you rethink everything you assumed about why the modern world looks the way it does, subscribe. Because this is exactly what we do every single week, and the implications genuinely never stop expanding the further you follow them. Historian Basil Davidson, whose research on pre-colonial African civilizations was genuinely ahead of its time, argued for decades that the historical isolation of sub-Saharan Africa from Eurasian networks was the single most consequential geographic accident of the past 3 millennia. Davidson wasn't speculating. He was looking at the actual trade goods, the actual population movements, the actual institutional developments of West African states, and pointing out that the capacity for complexity was always there. The Great Mosque of Djenné, built in the 13th century, remains the largest mud brick structure on Earth. The University of Timbuktu. And I want to be precise here, because people often treat this as mythological. held somewhere between 25,000 and 700,000 manuscripts at its height, covering subjects ranging from mathematics to astronomy to jurisprudence, a body of scholarship that scholars like Mahmoud Kati were actively expanding at the same time that European universities were still in their infancy. All of this with the desert in place. All of this in the thin, viable strip along the Sahara's southern edge, trading across one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Remove the desert, and this tradition of scholarship, this infrastructure of learning and exchange, doesn't just survive. It expands into a continental network. It connects. And connected intellectual networks, historically, are where the transformative leaps happen. And I want to stay with the technology question for a moment longer, because it opens the most personally confronting part of this alternate timeline. The question of what human scientific development actually looks like in a world where the Sahara never forms. Science historically does not happen in isolation. The most transformative periods of scientific advance, the Islamic Golden Age, the European Scientific Revolution, the modern research university, were all built on the accumulated intellectual inheritance of multiple civilizations exchanging ideas across connected networks. Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba synthesized and extended Greek mathematics, Persian astronomy, and Indian numeracy simultaneously. And it was that synthesis that gave Europe algebra, the astronomical tables that made ocean navigation possible, and the medical knowledge that underpinned the first European universities. The Islamic Golden Age happened in part because the Islamic world sat at the intersection of trade routes that connected the Mediterranean, Central Asia, and, to a limited extent, across the narrow Saharan caravan routes, West Africa. The connection was thin, the barrier was still there. But even with the barrier, ideas moved. Remove the barrier completely, and the intellectual exchange that produced the Islamic Golden Age happens across a network 3 times larger, drawing on traditions and observations from Central Africa, the Great Lakes region, the Ethiopian highlands, and the West African savanna, environments that generate entirely different biological, agricultural, and meteorological knowledge than anything available in Eurasia. What that synthesis produces is genuinely unknown, but the historical record strongly suggests it would produce it faster, and it would produce it in forms that the purely Eurasian intellectual tradition could not have generated alone. Stay with me, because this is where it gets philosophically uncomfortable. The technology that defines modernity, everything from germ theory to calculus to industrial chemistry, is not the inevitable output of human intelligence applied to the natural world. It is the specific output of specific intellectual traditions, exchanging with specific other traditions in specific geographic and institutional contexts. Change the network, and you change what gets discovered, when, and by whom. A connected Africa-Eurasia intellectual world centered on a fertile continental interior rather than a narrow Mediterranean coast does not produce the same modernity that we actually inhabit. It produces something different, probably more, possibly much sooner, that most people don't fully register because I think it sounds like an agricultural footnote when it's actually the load-bearing fact of Western history. Roman historian Peter Garnsey's demographic analysis of the empire's food system shows that North Africa, Egypt, and modern Tunisia combined produced roughly 60% of Rome's annual grain requirement by the 1st century of the Common Era. Without that supply, the city of Rome cannot sustain a population above roughly 250,000 people. That's a fact based on caloric modeling and agricultural yield data. The Rome that built the Pantheon codified the legal system that still underlies European law, that spread Latin across the continent. That Rome required 800,000 people, sustained on grain that came almost entirely from North Africa. And that grain came specifically from a North African coast backed by desert, because the desert kept the land productive, the population manageable, and the trade routes navigable by sea. In a green Sahara world, North Africa's productive capacity doesn't diminish. But it doesn't flow toward Rome. It flows in every direction, north to the Mediterranean coast, south toward the Sahel, east toward the Nile corridor, west toward the Atlantic. The economic gravity that in actual history pulled everything toward the Mediterranean simply doesn't exist because the Mediterranean is no longer the only viable exchange network in the region. Rome either finds another grain source, and there isn't one remotely comparable, or Rome stays small. And a small Rome doesn't build the legal and administrative skeleton that later became the framework of European political organization. The nation-states of modern Europe, the concept of Roman law, the Latin-descended languages, the Catholic Church's organizational structure, all of it traces back to the specific scale that Roman urbanization achieved. And that scale was only possible because of North African grain. And North African grain flowed north because a desert stood behind it and left it nowhere else to go. And just to be clear about what we're actually talking about in terms of the present moment, because this is the implication that lands hardest once you've followed the whole chain. The Atlantic slave trade, which shaped the modern world more completely than almost any other single institution, was built on a specific asymmetry. European maritime powers in the 15th and 16th centuries arrived on the West African coast with technologies, ocean-going vessels, gunpowder weapons, metallurgical techniques developed within a 1,000-year Eurasian exchange network that sub-Saharan African states did not possess, not because of any innate difference in capacity or intelligence, but because they had been cut off from that exchange network by a desert. Historian John Thornton's analysis of pre-colonial African military organization makes this absolutely clear. The kingdoms that faced Portuguese and Dutch pressure along the Gulf of Guinea were sophisticated, militarized, bureaucratic systems. They were not primitive. They were asymmetrically equipped. Specifically, they lacked gunpowder weapons and naval architecture, technologies that had diffused through Eurasia from China and the Islamic world, across connected overland and maritime routes that bypassed sub-Saharan Africa entirely because, again, there was a desert in the way. In a green Sahara world, that diffusion happens differently. The iron-working knowledge that actually developed in sub-Saharan Africa independently, documented in the Great Lakes region of East Africa as early as 1500 BCE, predating many European iron-working traditions, develops in connection with, rather than isolation from, the metallurgical traditions of North Africa, the Islamic world, and the Mediterranean. Documented. Primary sources confirm it. What the Green Sahara provides is not the capacity for technological development. That was always present. But the connectivity that allows technologies to diffuse, combine, and accelerate. And by the time European maritime powers begin their southward expansion along the African coast, they are not meeting a technological laggard. They are meeting a continental civilization with comparable or superior material resources and no particular reason to accept terms of trade designed to impoverish them. The racial and economic hierarchies that structured modernity, that shaped every society on Earth through the colonial and post-colonial periods, that persist today in wage distributions and wealth gaps and institutional structures of international finance. None of that follows automatically from human nature or from some predetermined hierarchy of civilizations. All of it traces back through specific historical decisions and accidents to a geographic event. A shift in Earth's orbital tilt. Something that happened in space, reflected in the angle of a planet 6,000 years ago. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, that I cannot make peace with, no matter how many times I work through the full chain of it. The world you were born into is not the world that had to be. It is one world, produced by a specific sequence of events, many of them enormous and deliberate, most of them small and accidental, that could at almost any point have branched into something so different that the present map of power, wealth, and human geography would be essentially unrecognizable. Paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer has documented the out-of-Africa migrations that populated the entire planet. The journeys across the Green Sahara that brought anatomically modern humans north into Eurasia, roughly 60,000 to 80,000 years ago. Journeys made possible precisely because the Sahara was then what it could have permanently remained: crossable, habitable, a highway rather than a wall. The ancestors of every person outside sub-Saharan Africa passed through that corridor. The Green Sahara is not a historical curiosity or an alternate future. It is the condition that made the human world possible in the first place. What ended it is an orbital wobble. What followed from that ending is everything: the desertification of a continent's interior, the compression of populations that produced Egypt, the channeling of trade that produced Rome, the isolation that produced the asymmetry that produced the slave trade, the specific configuration of power that produced the modern world. A world that presents itself as natural, as inevitable, as the product of human competition fairly played, when it is actually the product of a single degree. Think about that, 1 degree. And the world you inhabit follows. Before we close this out, drop a comment and tell me which part of this changed how you think about the relationship between geography and human destiny. Was it the compression that built Egypt? The grain that sustained Rome? The isolation that produced the technology gap? The moment where you realized the modern world is built on a wall that didn't have to be there? Because your answer to that question says something interesting about where you entered this history, and something even more interesting about how you think about where we go from here.